Hi, welcome to the Hungarian Living podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Sabo-Voss. Our goal is to discover, celebrate, and share Hungarian heritage and encourage you to do it too. We'll touch on food, travel, history, music, and language, and share stories from our listeners. We're glad you're here. This is a podcast where we'll encourage you to dig deeper to learn about your Hungarian heritage in a variety of ways. We'll have thought-provoking conversations and share resources. So whether you know a little or a lot about being Hungarian, this is the place to be. Welcome to the Hungarian Living podcast. I'm your host, Liz Sabo-Voss, and today I am visiting with Lisa Jackson, who wrote Serenade of a Swan, the story of Katalin Boda Jahoda, a memoir about her Hungarian mother's life. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here and to share my family's experience and connection with Hungary. I'm really proud of my mother and my Hungarian roots.
Well, before we chat about your book, let's just talk a little bit about your Hungarian heritage. In what area of the U.S. did you grow up?
I was born in Manhasset, Liz, and that's just outside of New York City. I'm the oldest of 4 children, each a year apart. We moved to Huntington, Long Island in New York when I was a year old, and I lived there until I went to college in Washington, D.C. in 1979.
So was there a strong Hungarian influence where you lived, or did it mainly just come from within your family?
I would say that it definitely came from within my family. After immigrating to the United States from Hungary in 1956, December, my mother first arrived at Camp Kilmer in New Jersey. At that time, New York and New Jersey had a very large presence of Hungarian communities, and they still do. But unfortunately, when we moved to Long Island, there were not as many Hungarian people. In our town, I don't remember any Hungarian friends. We certainly were an anomaly. No one else spoke like my mother, but to us, it was just normal. My mother did have a few best friends who she knew in Hungary, who had also immigrated during the Hungarian Revolution. Most of them lived in New York City and other surrounding areas to the city and also in Canada. We were very close to these families and we visited them quite often. We also went to Hungary a few times while I was growing up to visit my mother's family and friends. Like I said, she was the youngest one, the only one to come here, so her entire family was in Hungary. Whenever we were there, we tried to speak mostly Hungarian, as my mom's brain would get tired from too much translating. She would always complain about that. It seems like we were immersed in her large family's daily way of living when we were there, and it was really different from the way I grew up in the suburbs of Long Island. The Bodas, my mom's family, had a lovely home in Szeshalom. Szeshalom's a suburb outside of Budapest, and they had lived there since they were forced out of their home in the little village of Kolost, where she was born. That was at the time of the Soviet occupation. So in the suburb of Budapest where they lived, they had a very tiny parcel of land, and they had filled it with fruit trees, rose bushes, chickens, a pig, root cellars, vegetable gardens, smokehouse, and a wine cellar. Mostly everything there was homegrown and homemade, including wine and even palinka. That was very different from what we had at home, so it was really quite the experience. The food was delicious, and all of their neighbors pretty much had the same setup. We spent a lot of time just being with my relatives, having large, lively outdoor dinners, which was lunch to us because it was midday. And everyone seemed to eat, drink, and laugh and cry a lot. They would play instruments and sing ballads, mostly about their homeland. But there was a tremendous sadness in their voices as they sang about the Hungary that they knew before communism. Even as a young child, I could pick up on this. During those early days, when I visited, I remember the armed guards throughout the towns and cities at street corners. It was so ominous to see. We didn't have anything like that in the States.
Yeah.
So while we visited Hungary, of course, we toured all over Budapest, and my uncle Betty was a tour bus driver. So he would take us to different towns and villages throughout Hungary. And of course, we love Budapest. Some of our favorites, like with everyone else, probably were the Gellert Hotel, the thermal baths. We loved to ride the trolleys, buses, and trains. And we would always treasure hunt for pottery and trinkets in the out-of-the-way spots. We loved eating the fagylat, the Hungarian ice cream. Another favorite was watching the Chicos on the Hungarian Puszta, the Great Plains region. They were the horsemen. I wasn't quite old enough then to appreciate Hungary's history and architecture, but that came when I started to visit as a young adult. And by then I would hang out on the Danube promenade and dance in the disco boat clubs on the river with my cousins, visit museums and such. We also loved to visit relatives and friends outside of Budapest. They had vineyards, orchards, more land. And it was apparent to me how industrious, at least in my own family, it seemed like how industrious they were. It seemed like they could do or build anything, always with a creative flair.
Well, it's interesting to have that contrast, between what your life was like in the United States, but then when you would go visit, how different things were there. So that's kind of neat for you to be able to see those differences.
Oh, absolutely. And we loved to go. We couldn't wait to come back. I often thought my mom was very vocal about missing home and everything was done differently here. And, I think she really would have rather been in Hungary pretty much her whole life. And I could see why.
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. So do you recall anything, and of course, you have lots of awesome memories, but from your childhood that you now know was specifically because you were Hungarian? Because I think sometimes we just figure, oh, that's my family, or that's my family in Hungary, but that has really nothing to do with being Hungarian. But did you have any special traditions or foods, and were you able to maintain those kinds of things?
We did, Liz. My mom was really good about sharing her traditions and things like that. I guess, first of all, she was a fantastic cook, and she did make lots of Hungarian meals for us. Different from what we had at our friend's house. And our friends sometimes came over, liked it, sometimes they didn't. But some of our favorites, of course, that she would make was the goulash, the csirka paprika, potato and kolbász krumpli, and kapustas testa. Those are probably my favorites. When she and my dad entertained guests, she always cooked Hungarian for them because they loved it.
I bet.
Yeah, and she made the potato pancakes and fried langush, which were our favorites. And we would often go into Manhattan to an authentic and elegant Hungarian restaurant called Chicos. I don't know if it's still there. It was a long time ago, but she would always speak Hungarian with the staff, and she loved that. That was for special occasions. For holidays were big. She would make desserts, like the linzer, kifli, dobos torta, mash pita, and begli. She always encouraged us to help, so we were always in the kitchen with her.
Good.
And Christmas
I love to hear that.
Yeah, we did, and I still cook today. I love it.
Good.
I've expanded on it now. So since she passed away, I kind of feel my mother working through me in the kitchen. It's a very odd sensation.
Yeah.
Like I look at my hands and you know what to add, and it brings me close to her when I'm in the kitchen.
That's awesome. I love it.
Thanks. Yeah, and Christmas she went all out. So we would always make homemade decorations. She had some special ones that she brought over from Hungary that were very, very nice. And I remember making things like the silver tinfoil stars, the layered tinfoil, and we would always embroider felt ornaments and made decorations with fruits and nuts and pine cones. And she would also share with us the special traditions. She always talked about for St. Nicholas Day, she would put out the shoes when they were young and fill it with candy and nuts and treats. The one thing she did not like, and we heard a lot about it, was the emphasis in this country on material things. Lots of store-bought presents under the tree, more is better. And I guess she finally fell into where we had nice Christmases, but she would always let us know that this is not how she did it. Another thing, I guess, was where whenever it was her birthday, she always said, I don't celebrate my birthday. She never wanted to in the States on her real birthday. And she told us that her real birthday was on her name day. And the name day was when all of the Katalins would celebrate their birthdays in a more festive fashion. So the other part of it is growing up with my sister and I, we always had Hungarian clothes. Every time my mom would go from when we were very little, she'd bring back the blouses and the papuch, the slippers. We collected hair and porcelain and Hungarian dolls. I have a pretty large collection. My brothers would have things like those, on the pushta, the chicos used the long whips, and they would be cracking them and having fun with that. So we had a lot of Hungarian items. And we also were taught to sew and crochet. And
Okay.
so I think that was something pretty Hungarian. She always listened to opera and, gypsy music and Chardash, and we loved that. So while writing my book and reflecting on those memories, that a lot more came back, things that I hadn't thought about in years.
I'm sure. Yeah, one thing leads to another with that, as far as memories go.
It does. And, even things like songs, like singing, Hinta Plinta, the little swinging song, and the little child's finger song, Chippy Chippy Choka, Butchie Butchie Tarka, which was about a little cow. Those things came back, and we really were raised on those little songs, not so much the nursery rhymes. And then I guess lastly, I just wanted to share a funny little story. When I was about 5 years old, there were 3 of us born at that time, and it happened around Halloween time. My mom had made a big fuss always about how in Hungary they didn't celebrate Halloween the way we did. So she kind of resisted, but finally she took us out trick-or-treating, and for that first time, and she dressed us up in our costumes, and we roamed the empty streets. Where were all the other children? So we went to a few houses and collected candy, and it was probably 5 or 6 houses before a neighbor finally had told my mom that Halloween wasn't today, but it was tomorrow. So she took us out on the wrong day. But at that point in the neighborhood, we were just the crazy Hungarian family. No one understood my mom's accent. And she always did things differently when friends were over.
How funny that she, I mean, just one of those common things of misunderstanding, that happens. It even happens when we all speak English as our first language. But, even for her to make that mistake, but then for it to take a few neighbors to finally figure out, oh, I bet she just misunderstood.
Right. And they were just too kind to tell her.
Exactly.
I even have a picture of us, and we're not looking very happy.
So did you go out the next day then?
We did. We did. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So just occasionally things would crop up. There were certainly differences, but she really did try to make it to conform to the American way of life as much as possible.
Sure. But I love that she stood very strong also with the Hungarian things like her name day and different meals and, just even all the language exposure and the travel that you guys were able to do.
Oh, absolutely.
That's pretty awesome. So you heard Hungarian growing up then?
Of course. First off, my sister was actually named Ava. That's her first name. And my middle name is Zsuzsana, of which my mom really wanted to name me after her favorite niece and make that my first name. But my dad insisted absolutely not. Having a name Zsuzsana Jahoda was going to be a tough one, especially in school. He had visions of, the other kids calling me Juicy Jahoda and all these strange ways, because Zsuzsana is very hard to pronounce. So
you bet.
So that became my middle name instead. And I was glad at the time it wasn't, but now I would think it would be pretty cool to have that name. So we did learn a lot of words growing up, because she did speak a lot of Hungarian to us when we were very little. But unfortunately, as her English became better, our Hungarian became worse.
Yeah.
So I wish she would have continued, with her language teaching and speaking Hungarian, but she had 4 kids in a row, and I can understand why not.
Absolutely. And you do have the rhythm of the language. You have a lot of that stockpiled in your head. So
I do. And visiting Hungary often, we would always speak Hungarian there. We knew all of the key words, and, we certainly got to use it a lot when growing up in mom's house.
That's awesome.
And she also, another thing is she spoke to her friends, Hungarian friends and family a lot. Always spoke Hungarian. So we would hear that going on the when she was on the phone or when we got together. And my mom's sister in Hungary had always sent her the Hungarian newspapers and magazines frequently. And she would tell us some news, not in Hungarian, but share some news with us. So we were somehow connected. But overall, she really did try to assimilate into the American culture as much as she could.
Well, and that's a very, very typical story, I mean, because if you're living here and that's where your life is going to be, then you can't, you can't just not assimilate at all. So,
Yes, and my dad was adamant he was not going to speak Hungarian, so that made it a little more difficult having an American husband.
right, right. Okay. So what prompted you to write this book, and who was the intended audience initially?
Well, I guess it went back to high school when I decided to study English and creative writing, and also that in college as well. That's when she started planting a little seed. I was actually joking. She was always joking around about how I should write a book about her life story one day. And at that point, it was just a nice idea to me. I was pretty wrapped up in my own life, and I was very aware of the idyllic parts of her Hungarian childhood pre-war, and about the culture and her interests and her schooling. I knew where she went to school and jobs as a teenager up until the Hungarian Revolution. That's mostly what she shared with us, the good things. I really didn't know much about the war times and Hungarian politics. She really didn't discuss that. And she kept the stories of her own personal horrors that she and her family and friends endured, and the changes that brought to their lives under communist. That was pretty locked up tight. She didn't really share the strong emotions and the sadness, and we never went over that. So we really learned nothing of Hungary's wartime history in school either. They just don't teach that. But it was pretty obvious to me that she did lead an extraordinary life. It wasn't that I didn't want to write her story sooner. I just didn't know at that early age what she had revealed 2 years before her death in 2018. Life happened quickly for me, and my parents were also very independent, especially after we were all grown and gone. They traveled all over, the world, so didn't see them a whole lot. So it was, she was 80 and I was in my 50s. And before the idea came in, that's when the idea came into my head. And my mom had developed a very debilitating 7-year illness. It started in her mid 70s, and it's called Lewy body dementia. A lot of people haven't heard about that. But in a nutshell, the disease, it's the worst of the kind of senility or Alzheimer's diseases, and it slowly attacks the brain, causing mental illness and dementia. Different than Alzheimer's dementia, the personality actually changes a lot. And then it attacks the body by eventually paralyzing all faculties like it does in Parkinson's. So we were aware, it was very sad. I mean, we were aware, we knew something was going on for so long, but she refused to go to the doctor. My mother was a very proud person. And, was very resilient. And if there's something wrong, I could fix it myself. And she didn't like to go to doctors, and she would never admit weakness, which I learned was something, when I learned more about her life, I could understand why she had to keep up a brave front all the time. So I knew that she had always suffered bouts of depression throughout her life, even when I was young, and which I now know was a form of post-traumatic syndrome back from her upbringing. So as her symptoms were worsening, she did agree to go on some medication, and that actually brought her thinking pattern back. It really helped a lot. And she was more relaxed, and I guess say she was a different person the last 2 years. It was almost a blessing. As the physical stuff deteriorated, her brain was very sharp. So at that point, she was in an assisted care facility. And my dad was the one that really at that point would encourage me to write the book. And it started out was her nurses knew about her Hungarian past and certain behaviors. She was reverting back to very unusual behaviors. And they thought maybe it was, something from her childhood, the way she grew up, her dreams and things. So they really encouraged me to write a manuscript for them, for her healthcare providers, to learn to get to know her better, and so that they could, treat her and know better.
That's interesting how so many different angles, with your mom planting that seed initially, and then you coming to a place where you could say, all right, well, this is something I can do. But then your dad encouraging you, and then the healthcare providers encouraging you, it's like this all comes to this moment of, all right, well, now I have to do this.
Right. I felt like I had no choice, Liz.
Yeah,
And my
I'm sure.
dad was pleading with me, and I had a busy life at that point, but of course everyone does. So I agreed I'll write a manuscript. So that's pretty much how it started. And then I thought, well, whatever I write will serve as a memoir for my family as well.
Sure.
That was the spark.
So have you found a wider audience of readers than you originally thought? What has been the response to your book? I know I've read it and I loved reading it just because it's a real life story of somebody's, life. And even though I haven't met you personally, it's just this, it's like, but it's your mom. It's a story about your mom and your life too. All of that's in there. So what has been the response to the book?
Okay. Well, actually, Liz, yes, I did. It's much different than I originally thought. As I began sharing pages of this developing manuscript with my family and closest friends, I found they were pretty interested and wanted to hear more. I had also begun to share excerpts of her story on my favorite group page, which I know you're familiar with, the Hungarian Treasures. And I delved deeply into that, wanting to know everything about Hungary that I could, as well as some other Facebook pages. And being a part of this group was a huge comfort to me, especially after my mom's death, to connect with fellow Hungarians who were kind and compassionate and eager to hear more of her story. So everyone there encouraged me to continue writing. And it was at that point that I realized that my mother's story was similar to those of many Hungarians who lived during that time. Hungarian Treasures was growing, and the comments and encouragement to write her story for them as well inspired me greatly. So now I was excited to think that maybe this book could spark dialogue among other families of the 56ers.
Yes.
Because that's what I saw it doing. People were sharing their own stories on this site. And because I didn't really know a lot of Hungarian people myself at this point, so they were kind of my friends. So I learned that so many survivors were really unable to share their experiences of war and oppression with their children and families. I felt so bad, and people just were thanking me for giving them a glimpse into what their own parents experienced because they never were able to open up and speak. And like I said about my mom, I think it was just she decided she was going to do it, and it was a difficult thing having the interviews with me, but we got through it. And so the book just kind of took on a life on its own, and I became almost obsessed, certainly passionate about it. Yes, so that's kind of a book that I thought may bring some healing.
So how did you go about planning this book? I mean, it seems, like I said before, this whole thing, it's really been years and years kind of in the making, kind of in the background.
Oh, yes. My mom died almost 3 years ago, and it started 2 years before that. But she's been planting, like I said, planted the seed, and yes, it's been always there. Something that I felt like I wanted to do, but I didn't really know if I had it in me. So I guess getting started was the hardest part, as it always is, especially for writing. And I decided to first do a time frame. This is back when I was still thinking it's going to be a manuscript. So I did decide that I wanted the book to begin with her birth in Hungary in 1934 and go until she arrived in the United States to start a new life. I didn't want to go into our family, that was very American. So basically how she met my dad and had us, and, and just a brief little bit of her early American life. And just a small bit about raising her children as American mom.
Okay.
And then next I decided I'd make an outline of the different phases of her life. And I jotted down questions for mom, and I filled in the information that I knew of. I guess first I made the outline, put in what I knew, and then always had questions for her. So for that year and a half, while her brain was still well for the most part, we sat next to each other on the couch, either at her house or mine, and I interviewed her with my tape recorder. And I'll tell you, Liz, it was a really painful experience. She wanted at this point to share her deepest feelings, experiences, regrets, horrors. And so we had many brief sessions because it was very emotional. Her sifting through the words while she was crying and just pouring this out was very tiring. So of course I was in awe and I was devastated at this time as an adult to hear what she did endure. Finally, I was able to know, and it explained so much of some of the behaviors and dysfunction that I think she always experienced in addition to her joy. She was a very joyful person, but there was always this darkness. And really during her life, she had no one who she could relate to. Like I said, she'd closed up, not on a daily basis anyway. So it saddened me to think that she went on about her life, grieving in the whole time without it to come out.
Yep.
So then as I went on with the book and got as much out of her as I could, and my dad filled in some things, and her mind had started to go some, but not without sharing, as if you read the book, some very troubling things that happened to her personal experiences. I decided that I'd add a little bit of Hungary's history, the geography, and their unique culture in the book as well, because that certainly changed her life. And I did some extensive research on these topics, but my goal was always to explain to the readers the sequence of political events that swept through Hungary. I really wanted to make it readable. It took a long time. It's very complicated, as you know, Hungary's history and the wars and even the revolution. So it took a lot of time trying to comprehend it and put it into layman's terms and describe the politicians and the people who were kind of at the forefront. So as I said, I became really engrossed in the research as well. It's really the first time I'd learned of most of the politics. So the intent for the narrative quickly changed from a manuscript for my family to a book that I wanted to publish. And initially after I had done the first draft, I had a friend who was also a writer, and she was a linguist, but did not speak Hungarian, but had visited Hungary and loved it. So she agreed to read the manuscript and do some initial, mostly grammatical editing, which really helped a lot. So then by the time, I think I revised the book about 5 times and I felt I was done. I did finish it shortly after she had passed. And with each chapter, while she was alive, I was able to read it to my mom before she became too ill and, get her feedback. And she would always change a couple of things and cry pretty much throughout the whole thing. But she was so incredibly happy that I did that. And she knew that the next step would be publishing it. She was secure that I would do that. So it was a difficult achievement, but it was really worth it to me to realize one of her dreams and one of mine as well, to be an author. And so I guess it was about a year after she passed, I didn't do anything with it. I was pretty devastated. And at that point, I picked it up and I was able to have another person, friend of my dad, help me with the final editing. And also he had published books, so he helped me have it published because I knew nothing about that.
Right. How nice that all these pieces were in place, for that to happen. It's not like you had to go out searching, but it's like it was all laid in front of you.
Everything. And I didn't have to, pay for editing or anything. It just kind of unfolded. I think this book was meant to be written. There's a lot of serendipity along the way.
I'm sure. What is there a special passage that you would like to read for our listeners?
I would, Liz. I think I'd like to read from chapter 6, and that's called Forever Changed. And it was, again, an experience that they went through that I never knew, and I just couldn't even imagine. So I'm going to go ahead and read that now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Chapter 6, Forever Changed. One day, while fleeing from the Soviet armies, German soldiers came through the village of Kalost. Armed German soldiers terrorized and tortured many of the villagers and attempted to round up all the Hungarian boys and young men. The soldiers tried to capture and confiscate the boys so they could join in military pursuits against the Russians as they attempted to flee the country. This was when the Germans were coming through and the Russians were coming through and pushing the Germans out. So it was actually the atrocities were committed by the Germans. So the armed German soldiers entered homes and took whatever belongings they wanted. Women and young girls were raped and families were held at gunpoint. At one point, Kati's father was held with a gun at his head by a German non-commissioned officer. Kati, her mother, and brothers and sisters huddled behind their father, crying out loud, fearful that the German soldiers would kill their father, or all of them, or take her brother Laszlo. Luckily, a commissioned officer interfered to save her father's life, ordering the lower-ranking soldier to back away and let Lajos and his family go. Things were getting out of hand, and the German officer insisted that there was no time for this, as the Soviet army was fast approaching and they needed to leave at once. The Boda home had been raided, damaged, and some belongings and animals were confiscated. The village was left with much destruction. People they knew had died. Many villagers were now poor and broken-hearted, scarred by having witnessed the ugly truth of human violence at its worst. The Boda family survived, but were left with a kind of fear that would forever be etched into their bones. The lovely polished home and farm remained for many years only a mere skeleton, a barren reminder of the once bustling household. My family's main house was eventually re-inhabited and restored by other people and is home again. During that time, when my grandfather's general store had later been seized by the communist Soviet army, a married couple who were good friends of my grandparents pretended to be Russian sympathizers and were put in charge of his store. Things were so bad for this couple and they had lost everything, so they decided to jump the party line. My grandfather was made to serve as a mere employee in his own store. But this was an agreeable plan to Lajos, however, because with the Harshmans acting as communist supporters, they were able to ensure that his family and the villagers had ample food and necessary goods. My grandfather never did give in to the communist sympathizer movement. He never crossed the party line. He quietly stood by his principles and hopes for eventual freedom, while out of self-preservation obeying the new rules. I can only imagine my proud grandfather's spirit breaking as his life, his home, and even his family were eventually split apart, like the shattered shards of the prized Hungarian heron porcelain and other family heirlooms that were carelessly strewn around the floor that day. Shortly after the raid, it was apparent that Kalush was no longer a suitable place for the Boda children to make a life for themselves. The family wanted better from Magda, Laszlo, and Kati. There was little money or food and absolutely no jobs to survive. There was nothing productive for a young person to do and no form of recreation or entertainment. My mother hated the changes that war brought and seeing the family's hard work amount to nothing. More than that, she hated that her parents were constantly worried for the family's safety. And she found it hard to be brave when everyone around her was always crying. So eventually it was a painful but mutual decision that the three eldest children would leave home and go to Budapest to seek a better life. They had no other choice. My mother, Kati, was only 14 years old at that time, much too young to be on her own and away from the arms of her loving parents. It was decided that brother Laszlo would continue his high school education in Budapest at gymnasium, and her sister Magda would go to work in Budapest. Kati was to go to Budapest as well, to live in a boarding school with other children. Only her younger brother, János, who was 11 years old and not of sound mind and able body, would remain with his parents. While the preparations were being made, Kati felt as if she was in a trance. This could not really be happening. Somehow they would be able to remain together. But her parents stood firm, and not wanting to cause them any more grief, she, Lutzi, and Magda did not make a fuss. They all went through the motions of transitioning to their new homes, but the final goodbye was heart-wrenching. At that point, the crippling weight of the war's devastation cracked the brave front that each of them tried desperately to maintain. Everyone within the wide circle of the Boda's extended family and friends were overcome with sadness, not only for the loss, but in fear of a very uncertain future for all of them. My mother and her family and friends had no choice but to accept their lot, sullenly and grudgingly.
Hmm. What
Yeah.
a sad chapter. My
Yeah.
goodness.
I just can't imagine sitting there by your father being held at gunpoint. And he was actually what I guess would be considered to be like the mayor of this small village, and
Mm-hmm.
such a proud man. And really, they all thought at that point that they were going to shoot him. It was just a miracle that that
Mm-hmm.
non-commissioned officer came through and said, enough of this, and that they survived.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was a sad one.
Yeah, no kidding.
But it was a turning point in her life at 14 to have to leave her family.
Right. Wow. And it just, the loss of even just what they had, but also what they would have had they been able to be together, just that family sense.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, thank you, Lisa, for talking with us today. I really appreciate your time and the conversation and you sharing not only your history but also the snippets of your mom's and how the story came to be. So I think that was pretty exciting.
Well, thank you, Liz. It was actually my pleasure to speak with you as well. As like I said, it was a journey to write her story, and I just hope that other people can appreciate it and something to pass on to generations in my family. And it was my pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of the Hungarian Living podcast. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Lisa Jackson, author of Serenade of a Swan, the story of Katalin Boda Jahoda, a memoir about her mother's life. And we will include links in the show notes to the book. And have a great week.
Thank you, Liz. You as well. Take care.
Hungarian Living is a division of Magyar Marketing, the Hungarian store, where you can find meaningful gifts with Hungarian style. Check us out at magyarmarketing.com. And special thanks to Stephen Chichek and the Animal Cannibals for the show music. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Hungarian Living, please subscribe and share this podcast with your favorite Hungarian. Check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in this episode. If you have a question or comment, email us at podcast@hungarianliving.com. We'll catch you next time.